Hello and welcome to Lecture 8 of Philosophy and Religion, Creation and Time to Change. Due to the strikes, we've obviously missed 2 lectures, and we've missed the 2 on Aquinas, and Aquinas is an incredibly important figure in the history of theology. If for no other reason than it is Aquinas' theology that is the basis of the official doctrine of the Catholic Church, what is known as Thomism, given that he was Thomas Aquinas. So this lecture is obviously already quite different from the ones we've done before. Bear with me, hopefully it will work. So let's see how it goes. So I'm going to change things up a little bit from my usual formula. What I'm going to do is return first to the question we asked at the beginning of the course, which is, what is the divine? I said we'd start to develop some conception of what this might be throughout the course. And although I don't think this accounts for everything, I think one thing we've seen is that what the role the divine plays is something like a kind of ultimate ground. What do I mean by that? Well, it's an answer to sort of terminal why questions, right? So, sort of foundational why questions that one might ask. And I think that the 2 principal questions that have this character is something like, why is this the way the world is? And on the other hand, why is this the way the world should be? Now, when I say this here, I mean basically anything. The whole world is a certain way. All of the specific ways the world is, from the fact that I'm giving this lecture now quite way past midnight, and that we're having an election, and that strawberry ice cream is quite nice. All of these are contingent facts, which are features of the world that we might want to ask reasons for. And at the end of all of those changes of reasons, as we've sort of seen over the past few weeks, is God, or the divine, the gods, or whatever sort of fundamental principle you take to be the basis of reality. Similarly, when I say this in relation to how the world should be, what I mean is both the sort of presumed natural order of the world as we see it. So, for instance, people have children. These children grow up, they're taught, they age, maybe have children of their own, and then die. Right? We all have a tendency to think that this is a kind of natural state of affairs. But why is the world like that? Why does anyone have to die, for instance? But equally, we can talk about sort of aspects of the social order that we seem to institute. So, for instance, why do we drive on the left-hand side of the road? Well, okay, that seems a bit more arbitrary, but perhaps why shouldn't we kill other human beings? Right? We take that to be a fairly foundational ethical truth. Not everybody, but a lot of us. And if you do take that to be a fundamental ethical truth, you may want to know, why is this particular ethical truth the way the world should be? Why should I act in this way? So, and again, at the end of these chains of reasons, we find these ultimate principles. So we tend to think of this as a sort of difference between what I called at the beginning of the course sort of metaphysics and ethics. But the other way I would kind of like to put this is a distinction between, for instance, the causal order sort of laws governing causation and the ways in which things in the world change, and the normative order. And here, normative just means, it stands in for terms related to should or value, or related to values or questions of value. But here's, in essence, kind of the two jobs that I think, regardless of anything else you can say about the divine, this is what it seems to do within discourse. Now, in one of the earlier lectures, I said that religions tend to come with a sort of two different sorts of creation. One to do with the creation of the world, and one to do with the creation of humanity. And I sort of put the creation of the world to one side and talked about the creation of humanity. In particular, I talked about the Prometheus myth in Greek religion and the myth of the fall in Abrahamic religion. Now, I want to kind of come back to the first sort of myth. And I want to kind of broaden it out a bit, because really what we're talking about is cosmology. And this is a term that actually comes from scholastic theology and goes deeper into Greece, but the key point is, this is essentially that aspect of metaphysics that deals with the shape of the universe, like the structure of the universe as such. So when I was describing Aristotle's cosmology last week, or was it the week before last, as this sort of partition between the heavens and the earth, between unchanging and incorruptible motion and the things that change but are corruptible, changing change. And that was talking about Aristotle's cosmology. And there are two parts of the universe. And then, of course, there's the unmoved mover, God. What I want to talk about here is sort of three rough mythological patterns of cosmology within religions that get kind of refined and developed into sort of more precise metaphysics. And so the first one I want to mention is what we might call the wheel of time. And this is a kind of cosmological idea we might associate with Hinduism, Buddhism, and I believe also Sikhism, but I'm going to leave it off just in case I'm wrong. Crucially, this conception of the universe treats the universe as having neither a beginning nor an end, but rather going through continuous cycles. And crucially, this also means that you, instead of having a sort of creation myth of humanity, what you get is a conception of humanity as bound up with the Dharmic wheel, right? They're sort of like, and so this tends to lead towards ideas of sort of migration of souls and reincarnation. Okay, so that's one sort of cosmological structure. The second one I want to talk about is what we might call order out of chaos. And this is particularly interesting. That's something I want to kind of focus on today. So this is what you get in Greek religion and in a lot of polytheistic religions, where the idea is that, yes, there is a beginning to the universe, but the universe begins with some kind of primordial chaos, and then out of this emerges a natural order. So out of this emerge gods in some way. Now, what I want to kind of take us through is that this isn't simply sort of a feature of Greek polytheism, but is also actually a feature of early Abrahamic religion. So, of the sort of original interpretation of Genesis in Christianity and Judaism. So let me deal with the Greeks first, just because this is kind of interesting. So you can imagine how in Greek religion we have these sort of big questions about the world the way it is, why it is the way it is, and ethics. And as I explained in the first lecture, we end up with these sort of gods as embodiments of both natural forces and particular sort of values. But when you place one of these sort of gods at the end of this chain of why questions, it's still possible to ask, well, okay, but where did Zeus come from? And why is he the one who has the authority over what's right and wrong? Why is justice what he says it is? And interestingly, this sort of leads to a kind of backfilling of the history. There needs to be a kind of origin story for Zeus and his authority. And what this becomes in Greek religion is a story about how out of chaos emerge the heaven and the earth, which is to say Uranus and Gaia. And Uranus and Gaia have children, and some of these children, the Cyclopses and the 100-handed ones, get imprisoned in Tartarus by Uranus. And so Gaia convinces her son, Kronos, to castrate his father and take his place. And Kronos does this, right, and becomes king of this second generation of gods. At which point Uranus sort of curses him and says that the same thing will happen to him. And indeed, this is what happens. Kronos is himself a kind of despotic ruler, and his son, with the aid of his mother, Rhea, Zeus, frees his siblings and wages war on the gods. Right? So we actually have sort of two stages of chaos here. We have the original primordial chaos in which the original godlike entities emerge, but then we have a kind of war amongst the gods, and order is only truly realized when this war is won and Zeus is effectively crowned king of creation. You find these kinds of war in heaven present in other kind of religions. There's a particularly interesting one in sort of Norse mythology, where there's actually two different pantheons of gods, the Aesir and the Vanir, who are at war and then eventually reconcile and become a single pantheon. I don't want to say too much more about that, other than to point out that so the very sort of terms we're interested in here, sort of cosmos, which we now think of the world as the world, in Greek kind of it basically means order. And chaos essentially means its absence, which is to say, which is conceived more as void, or let's say abyss. Right? So cosmology is, in an important sense, a study of the order of the universe. Right. So we have two different sort of mythic structures. Oh yes. Here's how this plays into Abrahamic religion. So at the beginning of Genesis, the sort of first lines of Genesis are, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Right? Very similar to the Greek myth, weirdly enough. But God is described as, rather the spirit of God is described as floating over the surface of the waters. Right? So before God says, let there be light, right, and illuminates the darkness and then divides light and dark into day and night and thereby creates the first day, there is this sense of a kind of ambient environment within which creation is happening. Right? The waters, as they are described, play the role of this kind of primordial chaos, out of which God brings order and time. This is the sort of original way in which Genesis was interpreted. What happens in early Christianity is there is a pressure to revise this story because in some sense it fails to give God his proper place as infinite and all-powerful. Right? If there's something outside of God that constrains God's capacity to create order, this is a potential issue. I mean, we saw this again in the lecture on evil, right? Just in the sense of there being a kind of competing force, right, corrupting God's order. Here we aren't even talking about a competing force, we're just talking about anything outside of God. So what we get instead is this conception of creation ex nihilo. Literally, creation out of nothing. There is no further thing, no water, no chaos, out of which God creates the universe. God creates everything, and whatever everything is made out of. Okay, this is incredibly important for the Aristotelian theologians. It's something which they have to deal with, because, as I've mentioned before, Aristotle's own cosmology more resembles the wheel of time. Right? For Aristotle, God, the unmoved mover, is eternal, everlasting, unchanging. Right? And the heavens, although they move in the same cycles, and these cycles do not themselves change. Right? So for Aristotle, the universe always has been and always will be. Right? And although there will be these patterns of generation and corruption, or sort of emergence and decay on Earth, right? This is a drama that's part of a wider eternal cosmology. So, despite the fact that the Aristotelian theologians think that Aristotle is the greatest philosopher of all time, in fact, Aquinas and others simply refer to him as the philosopher. Right? If they talk about the philosopher, they're talking about Aristotle. They have to fundamentally disagree with Aristotle on this point, because Aristotle's God, as influential as his conception of God is insufficiently omnipotent. So, how is it that the Aristotelians go about this? So, here's the second change to the lecture format this week, which is I'm going to take the questions that I'd set on the course outline for today and break them down, but I'm going to break them down in the way that the Aristotelian thinkers were reading and talking about would break them down. And this is a good demonstration of why Aristotle was so important to these thinkers, because he enabled them to make these sorts of questions very precise. So, what's our first question? Can something emerge from nothing? This is basically just the question of whether creation ex nihilo makes any sense. And it's quite important for these thinkers to answer this question with a positive, because the impossibility of nothing coming from nothing was taken as a sort of given by a lot of earlier Greek thinkers. The idea that nothing comes from nothing was taken very seriously. So, okay, how do we break this down? Well, first of all, let's take this question of emerge from. What does that mean? Well, if we were sort of going back to the Neoplatonists that we were looking at earlier in the term, this is where they'd use the term emanation. They'd talk about the one and all of the various layers of creation emanating from it in this kind of sort of atemporal grounding which gives being that we talked about, in Augustine and similar thinkers. However, for Aristotelians, this is not sufficiently precise. For Aristotelians, they've got all of the different ways in which why questions can be answered. they've got these different sorts of causes that they're concerned with. So, first of all, we might sort of, instead of translating emerge as emanate, we might think about it as sort of be produced by. Right. Well, what's that? That's just what Aristotle calls the efficient cause. Right. Similarly, we might talk about being made of. Right. Being made up of nothing. Right. And this is just what Aristotle would call a material cause. You might also use the word composition there. Right. Could something be composed of nothing, right? Then, if we wanted to push this question a bit further, we might ask, what is the transition between nothing and something? And I mean, we could also just turn it back into a why question and ask, like, look, why does something come out of nothing here? And again, the Aristotelians have ways of breaking this down. So, first of all, they might talk about motion. Right? And for Aristotle, the Greek word for this is kinesis, by the way. Fundamentally, for Aristotle, motion is change of accidents, right? And accidents can be more than just space. So yes, it's possible for substances to move, for their place to change, but it's also possible for other of their properties to change. So if I've got a cup of coffee, it might be hot one moment, but wait an hour and it'll be cold. Right? Put it back in the microwave and heat it. You can heat it up again, right? This is a kind of accidental quality of the coffee, and these are different kinds of motion. Now, that is different from what Aristotle would call generation and corruption. So the heavens, right, the planets move, right, their locations change, right, but they're incorruptible because they are ungenerated, right? They were never made at any point, nor will they cease to be at any point. Whereas things on Earth, like human beings and animals, they were born and they will die. Right? There are kinds of change that bring substances into being and take substances out of being. And this is two fundamental layers, accident and substance. Now, the question then for Aristotelian theologians is, what is creation? Right? What is this thing that God does to bring about something from nothing? Is it motion? Is it generation? Or is it something else? And fundamentally, they're going to argue it's something else. Now, to break this down even further, we then might ask, well, okay, what produces this transition? And here we've got basically sort of two answers, right? You can say on the one hand, it's God's action or God's act, right? And what does this do? Well, this brings in our other two causes, right? Because what God's act provides is form and purpose, right? Or a formal cause and a final cause. But we might, on the other hand, interpret it as nothing itself. Right? And this is essentially what's going on in Greek mythology and in any religion in which we're talking about this production of order out of chaos, right? But this kind of crucially means that we want to understand what this nothing might be, right? In what sense can we think of this nothing as the prior chaos out of which something can emerge, right? Remember, chaos can be translated simply as void or abyss, right? So, what is nothing, right? Here's some options, right? One, we might just say, look, it's the absence of being. Right? Well, that's basically Augustine's position. It's also Parmenides' position. Right? What is nothing? Well, it isn't. That's all we can say. Right? But if we wanted a slightly more positive conception of nothing, we might alternatively say, wait a minute, what if it's the absence of beings? Right? Take the world and subtract the things in it from it, what do you get? Right? You could think of nothing as a kind of container, right? Maybe we think about it as the sort of space and time, right? And whatever else within which things can be. So when we interpret Genesis as sort of saying, okay, well, God is there in this void, and then he creates the earth and the heavens within it, right? There's this kind of ambient context. This is what we might think of as nothing as meaning. Interestingly enough, this is also the way in which Heidegger was interpreting the notion of nothing when we contrasted it to Augustine. Except for Heidegger, it wasn't a cosmological conception of a container, but rather a phenomenological one. He wanted to say that nothing is the sort of temporal structure of human experience, right? A world without any things to be experienced in it. Anyway, we'll put that to one side. So finally, we might take this a step further and say that nothing is just the absence of order. Nothing is just chaos without cosmos. Right? And here's the interesting thing is, well, what is that order? Well, it's sort of that form and purpose that we were saying God's action provides. Right? It's that causal and perhaps normative order, right? The structure of nature, which gives us the answers to all of our why questions. Let's move on to the other question that I set for this week. That's just breaking down, can something come out of nothing? The second question was, is change real? Well, okay, let's break this down again. What do we mean by real? Well, if we're taking Aristotelians and indeed Neoplatonists, right, reality is about substance, right? Ousia, right, which I've mentioned a few times already, which is a kind of standing under, right? Or we might also talk about it as ground. Ground. But in the sense in which something supports something else. So for Plato and for Aristotle, there are two fundamentally different conceptions of substance. For Plato, this is the forms. For Aristotle, this is what he calls primary substances or individual things. For Plato, it's the universals like man, and for Aristotle, it's the individual men, right? Or, any other universal you want to pick. Animals or types of matter or stars. Crucially though, this notion of substance is connected to conceptions of change. So if we were to take the conception of change put forward by Plato and Augustine, right? What we'd see is that change is thought of as becoming. Right? And fundamentally, for Platonists, this idea of becoming as a kind of transition between states is understood as a combination of being and nothing, being and non-being. That may sound a bit strange, but if you take my example of the coffee cup before, right, how does it get from being hot to being cold, or vice versa? Crucially, as far as Platonists are concerned, right, there's got to be a point at which it both is and isn't hot, and is and isn't cold. Right? But crucially, they don't make any significant distinction between this and the cup coming to be, being formed out of clay or ceramic or whatever, and ceasing to be, being thrown to the floor and shattering, right? In both of these cases, they simply think that this is a sort of combination of being and nothing. Right? And this is why, for Plato and Platonists, the individual things in the world, in the sensible world or the realm of becoming, are fundamentally inferior to the realm of being, i.e. the forms. Right? So this is our substance. The unchanging forms. By contrast, for Aristotle and Aquinas, change gets split in two, as we've already kind of mentioned. We get motion and generation and corruption, which is to say, coming to be and ceasing to be. Right? And crucially, substance is understood as the persisting individuals. So the crucial point is, what's substance, what's real, are things that are capable of change, things that underlie change, things without which there could not be motion. Right? Ultimately, individual substances that persist are the ground of motion. Now, I have one final question to add here before I start going deeper into the specifics of the arguments. And that's a question that's kind of turned up before, but let's make it explicit. What is eternity? Well, what we've seen, or what we are seeing, is two different potential conceptions of eternity. Eternity is absolutely crucial religious concept. It's ultimately a cosmological concept, right? On the one hand, if we're Augustine, it means outside of time, right? God is eternal insofar as he simply isn't in time, right? He's atemporal. But the alternative to this is to think of time without end, time everlasting, right? And this is clearly the way in which Aristotle is thinking about the eternity of God and the eternal movement of the heavens, right? But it's also sort of religiously the way in which we tend to conceptualize everlasting life, right? The reward at the end of the Christian worldview, right? And how these two things are related and differ is sort of the crucial thing that the Aristotelians, namely Maimonides and Aquinas, are going to have to come to grips with. It's also the crucial connection between religious cosmology as it's being talked about by these theologians and what we call contemporary cosmology in physics. And that's what hopefully I'll get to in not too long. But before we get to that, we have to talk more concretely about the theologians we're interested in. So, again, we're interested in both Maimonides and Aquinas. And there's sort of two crucial things to preface here. So, for Maimonides and Aquinas, right, God is an Aristotelian God insofar as God is conceived of as the first cause. Right? God is this ultimate ground. But crucially, because we've got an Aristotelian conception of causes, right, there's three different senses of this. On the one hand, God is the first efficient cause. Right? God produces the world as it is. On the other, he's the first formal cause. Right? Insofar as God's mind is what imposes form upon reality and matter. Right? The ideas of God simply are the forms of things. Right? This is the sense in which God is all-knowing. But additionally, God is the ultimate final cause. Right? The purpose of everything in creation is God's design. However, there is a cause missing here. Where's the material cause? And this is the fundamental problem for the Aristotelian theologians. Right? And we can actually sort of split this problem in two. On the one hand, God has to be seen as immaterial. Right? God can't be made out of anything, because that would be some cause upon which God depended, right? Which would mean God really wasn't the first cause, right? And on the other hand, God has to create matter the matter of the universe itself, right? So he can impose form upon it, right? And what is he going to create matter out of? Well, you can't create matter out of more matter, so he's got to create matter out of nothing. Right? So this is the Aristotelian shape of the problem of creation ex nihilo. Now, here's the second important thing, which is that Maimonides and Aquinas both think that creation ex nihilo must be an article of faith. So what I mean there, fundamentally, they don't think creation and its character as this sort of like singular act of beginning the universe out of nothing can be demonstrated. They're not going to try and provide arguments that this must be the case. Rather, they simply need to show that it could be the case. Right? Aquinas will even go one further and argue against those people who try and come up with arguments as to why it should be. He wants to knock down both the arguments against creation ex nihilo and the arguments for creation ex nihilo in order to leave a space for doctrine. Why this is becomes sort of a lot more clear in Maimonides. Let's talk about Maimonides first. So, again, Maimonides thinks that there are three possible cosmologies. Right? He thinks we have Aristotle's cosmology, which is to say, basically, there's no beginning. There is no beginning in the world. The world has always existed, and it's split between heaven and earth, between eternal motion, right, and between eternal generation and decay. That's the shape of Aristotle's universe. And he thinks there's Plato's universe, right? And in Plato's universe, yes, there is a beginning. Right? But there's some primordial matter sort of essence of becoming that is then formed by the forms, right? So primordial matter meets eternal forms. In contrast to this, he thinks you have the Judeo-Christian view, which is just to say creation ex nihilo, right? Basically, these are the three kinds of religious cosmology we start out with. Sort of the wheel of time of a certain kind, the order out of primordial chaos, and then creation ex nihilo. The reason that Maimonides thinks it's so important to demonstrate the possibility of creation ex nihilo, and indeed to believe in creation ex nihilo. Well, let me put it in this way, right? So, why creation ex nihilo? On the one hand, we have interventions, right? So, like miracles, right, or prophecy. So for Maimonides, like, these are the crucial acts of God that we can say something positively about. We can talk about their occurrence even if we can't explain the reasons for their occurrence, right? This is the sort of crucial aspect of doctrine as far as he's concerned. But then there's also a question of uniqueness, right? And for Maimonides, this is the law of Moses, right? Maimonides wants to be able to say why. In fact, no, he doesn't want to be able to say why. He wants to be able to believe in the exceptional state of God choosing to give the law, the one true and only right law, to one person and one people once in the whole of history. Right? That's the basis of the Jewish faith as far as he's concerned. Right? And he thinks that creation ex nihilo is required in order to ground this faith, because essentially what creation ex nihilo justifies is exception, right? An exception to what? Exception to any kind of causal order or causal law. So causal laws, as we understand them, are generalities. They tell us about kinds of things that can potentially happen again if the circumstances of the world recur to these, become the same again. So as far as Maimonides is concerned, if there's something outside of God that God has to act upon in order to create the world, like God is in some sense constrained by principles, constrained by principles that might prevent God producing singular, exceptionless, unique interventions within the world, such as coming down and giving the law to Moses. And I think this is essentially the same reason why Aquinas and others are interested in creation ex nihilo, is that it fundamentally founds every exceptional story within the history of religion. So in Christianity, why does Christ come down to Judea? Right? Why not China? Right? There's got to be some reason for these complete and unique events, right? And in a certain sense, it's got to be the absence of any external constraint, the absence of anything for which you might ask for ordinary reasons. Okay. Let's move on to Aquinas. So, the first thing to talk about when we think about Aquinas is, so the reading that was set for this week was the Treatise on Creation, and the Treatise on Creation has this very interesting structure. It's got a kind of a particular sort of method, right, which you might call a method of dialectic. So I've talked before about how arguments aren't always monological, they're often dialogical, right? We have, we make a claim, someone objects, we respond to that objection, right? There are arguments for and arguments against. What's fascinating about Aquinas is he gives both, right? He wants to argue for something by first laying out the strongest arguments for the opposite, and then providing counter arguments to them, right? And the two things that he's trying to do in the Treatise on Creation is, on the one hand, demonstrate what we might call the logical possibility of creation ex nihilo, right? But then he's trying to argue at the same time against, right, the logical necessity of creation ex nihilo. And how does he do that? Well, he starts off by arguing for its logical impossibility, rehearsing all of the arguments that can be made against the position he wants to take, and then he breaks them down. By converse, he then develops all the arguments for the logical necessity of a creation ex nihilo, and then provides responses. Now, I'm not going to deal with every single argument there, because there's quite a lot. But I am going to try and present the three important ones as I see them for understanding the questions that we've gone through thus far. Before doing that, we need to kind of revisit, again, unfortunately, a couple claims from Aristotle. So, for Aristotle, motion, which is a particular kind of change, accidental change, right, is the actualization of potential. So take my example of the coffee cup before, or cup of coffee. It's because the coffee as a substance has the potential to be either hot or cold, right? That it can go through the process of changing from one state to the other, right? Motion is the actualization of a potential, right, within that substance. Secondly, for any change, right, not just motion, but also generation and creation, change must have a substrate. Right? In order for there to be change, there has to be something that is changing. What Aquinas is going to do is to show how creation ex nihilo fits into this framework in such a way that it creates a kind of exception to the normal Aristotelian picture. So let's look at the sort of three different processes of change we were talking about earlier. We've got motion, we've got, let's go with making, which is a specific kind of generation, right? And then we can talk about creation. So let's say, and this is Aquinas' own example, that motion might be a process whereby something which is non-white becomes white. Making might be a process where something that is, let's say, non-statue becomes a statue. Right? Now, creation is a process in which nothing becomes something. All of these are essentially transitions between non-being and being, but at three different layers. Now, what I was saying before about change having substrate and motion being the actualization of potential, what that means is that when we think about motion, right, there is something that is undergoing that change, right? There is a substance, right? A substance that has the potential to have both kinds of accident. When we talk about making, right, going from non-statue to statue, right, we're going to talk about the matter, right, the clay, which is taken before it is a statue and then formed by the craftsman into the new substance, which is a kind of a unity of form and matter, right? But the matter still has potential, right? It just is potential to take on a variety of forms, right? The act of the craftsman gives actuality to this passive potential. The question then seems to be, what's going on in the transition between nothing and something? Is there something which is constant across this transition? is there something in which this potential inheres? So these are basically the arguments that Aquinas makes and then refutes. So if I was to put forward the first argument, right? Aquinas basically says, and this is sort of similar to what we saw in Ibn Sina. He says every motion, right, is produced by another motion. And this creates regress, which means there can be no beginning. There can be no first motion, no beginning in time, because there's always going to be a further motion going further and further back. Now, his reply to this is that God can create substances in motion. Right, so all of the earthly things that there are going through a variety of different processes of change constantly, right? Those processes of change don't need to be initiated by previous forms of change. In creating substances, God is creating things that have accidents and are transitioning into other accidents. They're already in motion. This is just what it is to be the kinds of substances that they are, right? There doesn't need to be an initial motion. There can simply be the creation of the universe in process, right? What's the second argument then? This comes back to this. In essence, Aquinas says we talk as if creation is making. You know, this is a classic part of Scripture. We say that God made the earth in 7 days. Right? We have this description of the different things he did in the process of making. Right? And if we describe creation as making, then we have to think that there's something that is constant across this process, right? We have to think that there's going to be some matter, right, or some substance. Now, Aquinas' response to this is basically that it's just the way we talk. Like, yeah, okay, sometimes we sort of slip up and we loosely sort of say, well, God made the earth, right? But that's just imprecision, right? It's a kind of coincidence of language and understanding. In truth, the transition from nothing to something doesn't need any matter, right? It's something which is, dare I say it, instantaneous and complete. Right? There is simply nothing, and then there is something. here's the third argument. And I think this is the most interesting. Okay. And this is an argument that fundamentally depends upon the Aristotelian framework, right? Because it's fundamentally about the concept of matter, right? So I've said that matter is potential, right? But that's generally taken as a way of explaining what matter is, right? Aquinas turns this on its head and says, no, potential is matter in the Aristotelian framework, right? But if it's possible to create something out of nothing, if it's possible for God to create the world, right, then there's got to be something in which that possibility or potential inheres. There's got to be something that can become the world. Right? Now, the reason that this is interesting is because in order to reply to this argument, Aquinas has to make a very interesting philosophical distinction, which is he has to say basically that there's a difference between absolute possibilities and relative ones. And another way of putting that is to say that there's got to be a difference between logical possibilities, right, and causal capacities, right? So to give a very trivial example, right, it's logically possible, right, that I have a second sister. I only have one, but it's logically possible that I could have two, right? Okay. You might want to say, yeah, but there's always the capacity that your parents might have a second child. Oh, okay, right, maybe. But say my parents die, right? Where does the possibility of me having a second sister live, right? And what does it inhere, right? It's just an abstract possibility, right? Even though it cannot be causally realized. Aquinas is essentially having to say, creation ex nihilo is an absolute possibility, right? Because it's logically coherent. It's not logically inconsistent. Like, for instance, the idea of something that is both round and square, right? It's not logically impossible, therefore it's logically possible, right? And that's sufficient. That's all God needs, right? Because God is infinitely powerful and can realize anything that is logically possible, right? Okay, so I think that's everything we really need to know about the conception of creation ex nihilo, right? And how Maimonides and Aquinas have to modify the Aristotelian framework in order to fit it in. Crucially, they have a conception of God as immaterial, as creating matter and forming that matter out of nothing, right? And doing it towards his own end, doing it towards an intention which is, in essence, the good, right? The natural order that is his design. And the infinite and unlimited power of God is indexed by this capacity to go from nothing to something without any passive potential, right? God is purely active, right? God is so active and powerful that he needs no passive recipient of his power, right? Okay. So cosmology. I tell you what, I'll abandon writing on the board, and I'll try and just say something a bit more spontaneous, because I'm often already way over time. So I set 2 readings optionally for this week, which I do recommend taking a look at. They're quite easy. They're sort of pop science pieces by 2 physicists, and they're 2 physicists who explicitly have metaphysical interests, right? They both think that cosmology enters into the realm of philosophy. So the first is Max Tegmark. And Max Tegmark essentially thinks that time isn't real, right? What he means by that really is that time isn't fundamentally different from space. This is an idea he takes from Einstein. So Einstein will talk about space-time, how the universe has 4 dimensions, 3 spatial and 1 temporal, and how gravity bends all of this, right, such that the rate of flow of time can differ between, say, being on the ground on Earth and being in Earth orbit. Tegmark takes this idea that time and space are fundamentally the same thing to its logical extreme, and says that in essence, eternity, right, is the perspective outside of time, the God's eye view of creation, right? Even though none of this has anything to do with God anymore. God isn't part of his cosmology, but the perspective is, right, the perspective of eternity, and from that perspective, the universe is crystalline, right? There is no change. Everything that has happened and will happen is already determined, right? And from that perspective, he will say what we are as individuals is braids. We are braids in space-time. We are these 4-dimensional patterns of things wrapping themselves around each other, right? Organs, right? Cells, molecules, atoms, entwined in a dance that has already played out. All the steps are there, choreographed in advance, right? There's something kind of strangely beautiful about this. And indeed, very Platonist, right? Indeed, maybe even beyond Platonist, Pythagorean. Right? What do I mean by that? Well, Tegmark thinks that the universe simply is a mathematical structure, right? This perfect atemporal crystal just is mathematics, right? It's a pure eternal form. So you can see how, even though Tegmark's picture isn't explicitly theological, God is no longer there, it is of the same kind as Plato and Augustine's, right? The difference is that whereas Augustine had to say that, well, God is eternal, and the past and the present, the past and the future aren't real. They're just contained in the present. Tegmark also goes a step further and says, no, the present doesn't exist either. Right? The present itself is an illusion of eternity. Now, interestingly enough, this means that he also seems to take the position that time has a beginning, right? Because just as the universe has a spatial extent, right, it has a sort of spatial limit, it has a temporal, right? So, yeah. By contrast, Lee Smolin, the other physicist, thinks that time is real. In fact, quite provocatively, he says time is the only thing that is real, right? He thinks that the laws of nature evolve. Right? He thinks that, that's what he calls cosmological natural selection. He thinks that when the universe creates black holes, these black holes themselves contain new universes that themselves then generate new black holes, right? And what happens through this is a kind of process of mutation and selection, right? That the universe is this kind of ongoing and indeed eternal process of cosmic evolution, right? So Smolin gives us this picture of the world in which time is once more eternal, right? It's not necessarily cyclical. It's no longer quite the wheel of time. It's a constant progression and evolution, right? But it has no beginning and no end. Smolin will even go so far as to say that space is an illusion, but time is real. And in this, he is sort of strangely closer to Aristotle than Aquinas. His conception of eternity is one of the everlasting, right, of time without end, rather than the outside of time. In fact, he will accuse people like Tegmark of being basically beholden to religious theology, because he thinks the very notion of the God's eye view, the ability to get outside of the universe and look in, is what creates this sort of illusion of space that denies the reality of time, right? To be in the universe is to be temporal. So for him, crucially, our subjective experience of the present and the flow of that present, that is what is essentially and irreducibly real. Fascinating. Anyway, I think I'll stop there. Just to say that the reason I was interested in bringing these thinkers forth is to show that there remains a continuity between the cosmological speculation contained even in religious mythology, even in our most sort of basic stories about the nature and shape of reality, and our most cutting edge theories about that reality. Right? There is a fundamental continuity here between religion and science, which isn't often emphasized. we'll stop there.